Hi, I'm Ron and welcome to PopScicle, where I talk about pop culture, science, and everything in between. Today we'll be having the second episode of D&D Ecology. Whereas in the first episode we talked about coastal adventures and ecosystems, today we'll be talking about grasslands. The image is quite common in fantasy literature and in RPGs. A band of adventurers traversing a plain full of grass, occasional trees, okay, but mostly just a sea of grass as far as the eye can see. And there are so many different creatures grazing and traveling across this grassy plain along with the adventurers. And this is a very good setting to have, despite looking so plain and looking so homogeneous or um, the same everywhere. There's a lot of diversity in plant and animal life to be had in grasslands. And so that also translates into a lot of different things that you can play around with, especially if you add the fantastic elements. So let's begin with an overview of the ecology of grasslands on Earth so that you can use this as a starting point for your own grassland adventures. On Earth, there are two general major types of grasslands. You have the tropical and the temperate. There are some subtypes. For example, there's what we call xeric grasslands, which are the very dry ones. But for now, we'll stick to the two major ones. And these depend on, obviously, the climate. One is found in the tropical belt, just between tropical rainforests and deserts. Deserts being found usually at 30 degrees latitude north and south. And tropical rainforests found anywhere from 0 to 10 degrees. Then that would mean tropical grasslands, or what you would call savanna, are found somewhere between 10 and 30 degrees latitude. Now, tropical grasslands or savannas are quite different from temperate grasslands in several ways. First of all, the most obvious one, if you go there, is that there are occasional trees dotting the landscape, whereas in temperate grasslands or prairies, there aren't any trees. This is really because there's a lot more water in tropical grasslands. As you would know, the nearer you go to the equator, the more rainfall there is, and that has something to do with the fact that there's more sunlight driving the hydrologic or the water cycle, which includes, of course, the amount of precipitation. Tropical areas are notorious for having heavy rainfall, and that also includes tropical grasslands, although, of course, they tend to be drier than tropical rainforests, but not as dry as deserts. And so there's a bit more water to be had by trees. Although one of the major reasons why there aren't a lot of trees in tropical savannas is also the rain, particularly lightning storms. When lightning strikes trees and grass, there's wildfire that can rage for a long time. It will burn surface vegetation, particularly the trees. The fact is the grass can survive better because they can easily regenerate after a fire because of what they have under the ground. Whereas trees are not as hardy against these fires. So it's really the herbaceous vegetation or grass that tends to dominate in these areas. So lightning storms are actually a very important ecological feature of these ecosystems. In general, however, the soils of tropical savannas or grasslands are quite infertile. They're not as rich as those in temperate grasslands. And this is also because of the rain. A lot of that water leaches the nutrients, meaning pushes the nutrients essentially downward, deeper into the soil. So it's harder for top surface soil of tropical grasslands to be nutrient rich. As a result, the grass in tropical grasslands tends to be drier and less nutritive than what you'd find in temperate grasslands. In terms of animals, the ones that you typically associate with the safari or with Africa are those that are found in savannas. You have the large predators like lions, and you also have the large herbivores like elephants and zebras and other equines. But you also have, of course, a lot of different birds and snakes and insects. It's a very diverse type of ecosystem. Now, when you go to the temperate grasslands, which are found much further north, in areas where there are seasons, of course, the 4 seasons, you would have less rainfall in general. However, the soils are much richer as a result of that. And so there's lush growth of grass, and these grass tend to be very nutritive. In fact, that's something that you can play around with in your games. The grass and the roots and the other plant parts under the ground can be used as sources of nutrition when desperate, unlike in the tropics probably. And there aren't any trees again because the grasses outcompete very effectively the trees, especially because there isn't so much rainfall compared to tropical grasslands. So when you are on a temperate grassland, as far as the eye can see, there won't be a single tree. Whereas in the tropical grasslands, you will find quite a number. And these trees are used also as shade by several animals. In terms of the fauna, temperate grasslands would have some similar organisms, of course, a wide variety of birds, also in insects and rodents and the like. But you don't have those large predators usually, like lions. But you do have large cats also. And you have wolves. You have, as well as a lot of predatory birds. And of course, you have the migratory mammals, the herds, like the bison, for example. And this is what really characterizes prairies and temperate grasslands to a lot of people. The herd of massive mammals. So from those considerations, you can already start playing around with what monsters you'll put in. Although I will be introducing a few interesting monsters that you can put on your Grassland Adventures. Speaking of monsters, those that are listed as Grassland monsters in the Dungeon Master's Guide, Volo's Guide to Monsters, and Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes are pretty accurate in terms of what you'd usually find in grasslands. Bear in mind that in the tropics, you would also find occasional trees. So again, you can play around with the treant being found in tropical grasslands, and maybe these would be hardier than usual, given that they are exposed to such harsh conditions for trees like lack of water, deeper into the soil, so they would have deeper roots. And they are struck by lightning more often than not. So maybe you can add a feature similar to that of the shambling mound when it comes to lightning to a tropical savanna treant. And it would be nice to play around with the psychology probably of a treant, given that there are so few of them and they're so far apart compared to typical forest treants. Now, I'm introducing to you two new monsters that you might want to add to your adventures. Again, the caveat here is I have not playtested these monsters even with my own gaming groups. Hopefully, I'll be able to do that soon, but please, if you do get to test these monsters, let me know how it goes. The first one is not my original creation. It is the Malboro from the Final Fantasy video game series. I just played around with it. I've been very interested in this monster ever since I started playing Final Fantasy and encountering this monster in the game. So I think it's a great monster to add to a grassland encounter. So I came up with my own statistics for the Malboro, my own interpretation, and here you see the statistics of the Malboro. I will be making it available through a link that I will be posting below, so you can just check it out. So as you can see, its primary weapon really is the Bad Breath. It's quite a tough creature at this high CR, and as you can see, just like in the game, the Bad Breath will confer multiple condition effects on the characters at a single time. So that's going to make it pretty difficult, and it also has legendary actions. So it can be quite exciting. I'm excited to try it out and excited also to get feedback from you on how it works. Now, the second one is something I created as inspired by ideas of grasslands being typical places for warfare, but also for discarding, dead bodies from war or from salvage situations. And so I imagine certain grassland areas being suffused with negative energy, necrotic energy even, because of all this death that has occurred on it, such that you can create an area-based monster. It's not a typical monster that has a corporeal form that you can really attack directly. It's more like an area effect that also translates into a monster. I don't know if I'm explaining it really well, but anyway, here is The Killing Fields, which is of course a title of a movie. This is also inspired in terms of the statistics. This is also inspired somewhat by Sandy Peterson's statistics for the color out of space in his Cthulhu mythos, which is a great resource for those of you who'd like to incorporate Lovecraftian lore and monsters into your D&D games. For him, color out of space is not really a traditional monster in multiple senses of that term. In fact, he equates it to or makes it a gargantuan ooze, just to give it form, I suppose. But here, my idea is that this is an undead form, given that it's suffused with necrotic energy, but you're basically talking about the soil and the grass acting like a single entity. Instead of monster, probably it's best to call it an entity. And like the color out of space, it's not traditional in terms of how you would defeat it. It's not something that you can attack head on. But there are ways, like you can see here, there are some spells that you can use that can damage it directly as long as you are within that space. And the only way to damage the creature is by using radiant energy, but you have to be within the space of the monster, but it's going to be very dangerous because every turn that you spend there will be multiple effects that can damage you or affect you in other ways. So it also excites me as to how this will play out as a monster. So again, please let me know how it works out if you decide to use the Killing Fields for your games. There are many spells, of course, that would be very interesting to use in the grasslands. For example, there's plant growth, which of course would be enhanced because there's all of that grass around you. In fact, you can probably add effects to it that are similar to the entangle spell, even if the plant growth is not really meant to be similar to that spell directly. Speak with plants would be an interesting thing to roleplay for a DM, because here, imagine if you cast Speak with Plants when you're surrounded by all of that grass. You can have individual grass blades talking to the character at the same time, and so the character will be bombarded with images and words, essentially, from the surrounding grass. So it would make for an interesting conversation, so to speak. There are a lot of insects in grasslands, including locusts, which could be pretty damaging. So if you use giant insect or swarm of insects, maybe you can add a bit more damage if locusts are summoned. And locusts can even also damage material things like clothing that are not metal based. So druids are probably in great danger when it comes to grassland encounters with swarms of locusts. There are some spells that are probably not going to be useful in grasslands, whether tropical or temperate. For example, the Conjure Woodland Being spell should be useless in my opinion if you want to be ecologically accurate somewhat. The spell Tree Stride would only be useful in savannas and not in temperate grasslands because there are no trees at all in temperate grasslands. And finally, when it comes to spells, it's probably the most interesting thing to think about how fire works when you're in a grassland. You're surrounded by all of that flammable vegetation. So it would be pretty risky to use a lot of area-based fire spells, especially those that do have the ability to combust materials. So maybe you can consider, for example, that there would be a disadvantage to saving throws against fire-based spells while you are in a grassland area. And or you can also consider that there would be enhanced damage. Maybe it's critical damage every time you get hit by a fire-based spell when you're surrounded by grass, especially if the grass is really bunched together. Depending on whether or not your DM agrees to it, the meta magic ability Careful spell by the sorcerer might be played around with such that it will not spontaneously and unwillingly combust the surrounding grass, because that will potentially be harmful to your party as well. So that's something that you can also consider playing around with. Given the link of grasslands to human civilization, we can argue that the human species really started here in grasslands, and a lot of our evolutionary traits like walking on two legs came out in our species because of our dependence on grasslands at a certain point in our evolutionary history. And given the fact that we are so reliant on grasslands as a species, and this is particularly true of those who have ranches and hold livestock. There's a lot that you can use as adventure hooks. Below in the description box, I have included some adventure hooks that you can use for grassland encounters or grassland adventures, and that includes an adventure linked to the Killing Fields, which is the monster that I introduced to you a while ago. So hopefully this video gave you several new options for encounters and adventures that are based on grasslands. And that's going to happen to your adventuring party at any time, most likely in the future, because grasslands are everywhere. Wherever there's fertile soil and a lot of water and a lot of lightning that causes wildfires that thins out trees, there could be swaths of grassland. And grassland form rather spontaneously on habitats that used to be something else. So you will encounter grasslands in the future, and so hopefully you'll be able to use a lot of these and enrich your adventures and make them more fun and exciting. So see you in the next D&D Ecology episode. If you liked what you saw, please don't forget to subscribe to PopScicle, and see you again soon.